Today's Imprint Weekly Podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child-welfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. It is the final Monday before the holidays, so it's time for our third annual Best of episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I went through the whole year, picked out 20 clips from some of the best interviews that we have done since January of 2022. We'll set each of them up a little bit, then play them for you. But if any of them capture your intrigue, you just want to bounce out of this one and go listen to a full episode, you can do that by going to imprintnews.org/podcast, and you can see our full archive there for you. In addition to that, I am happy to announce something we've been working on here at Fostering Media Connections for a while that's going to come to fruition in 2023, and that is the Safe Camp Podcast Network. We believe that Fostering Media Connections can go beyond our modest weekly program here and really serve as a podcast hub for different series and projects and podcast seasons that focus on youth justice, child welfare, and the many topics that relate to these systems. So stay tuned for more about that venture in early 2023. Last thing before we get started here, and we're going to go straight through the clips without a break once we get going. I want to do one final appeal for our annual News Match campaign. It's that time of year when nonprofit journalism organizations are looking to maximize giving through the News Match campaign, and we are no exception to that. If you enjoy this podcast or the great work that our reporters do at the Imprint and Fostering Families Today, or all of our work through the Youth Voices Rising program, please consider making a donation. And if you do so this month during News Match, your donation will get doubled. Fostering Media Connections is very lucky to have some terrific philanthropic supporters, advertisers and sponsors, subscribers to our business policy section that help make this organization go. But we really cannot do it without donors like you who read our stuff, listen to our podcasts, and attend our online events. And as I say at the end of every episode, it is super easy to give to us. You just simply visit us at imprintnews.org/donate. That's imprintnews.org/donate. All right, let's get started. We're going to begin with a clip from our first guest of 2022, who was Les Gara. At the time, he was running for governor of Alaska. Les grew up in foster care. He has been a state legislator in Alaska before and has been a great advocate for foster youth in the state. So in this clip, you are going to hear Les talking about an instance where him and a really, truly great foster youth advocate still in the state of Alaska, Amanda Mativier, joined forces to push back against a state decree that foster youth were not allowed to directly communicate with the press, which, of course, I'm a little bit biased as a journalist, really sticks in my craw to hear this story told. But this is a good example of, somebody in politics really getting together and really hearing the needs of youth who are in foster care and helping to kind of establish, in this case, their constitutional rights.
I went to a meeting and I ran into Amanda, and she'd started this group called Facing Foster Care in Alaska, and they were advocating for change. And I said, look, I'd love to work with you. And she said, well, we can't. We've been told we're not allowed to go to the press. You can't go to the press to talk about how the system's failing you. You can't go to the press to talk about your aspirations and how you can't achieve your aspirations and how you have great ideas on things that would help you achieve you can't go to the press. You don't have a right to free speech. And so she showed me some sort of letter, and I wrote the Attorney General, and I said, look, this is wrong. It violates the First Amendment. People have a right to speak. Even if they don't have wealthy parents, they have a right to speak. That's the First Amendment. And look, you can fix it and tell the Office of Children's Services they have to let these youth speak out on public policy issues, or I'll sue. And I don't know if the Attorney General did it because it was the right thing, or if the Attorney General did it because I was going to sue. I have no idea. Hopefully they did it because it was the right thing, but the Attorney General wrote back and said, you're right. It's a youth's First Amendment right to speak out. And so we got a letter from him that still sometimes there's a social worker here or there who says, oh, these kids aren't allowed to talk. Well, and then so Amanda carries around the letter with her and says, yes, they are. Here's the letter that the Attorney General wrote to Les. They are allowed to talk.
All right. Clip number 2 comes from episode 68. This is our interview with Ruth White, who is the longtime director of the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare. We talked to Ruth about a number of things, including the FYI vouchers. This is a kind of concept for an on-demand voucher that she worked with young people with lived experience in foster care to develop. It's a federal offer, like I said, of an on-demand voucher that a young person could get after foster care to kind of stabilize their housing situation. We talked about that. We talked about her concept for flat rent, which is at the end of the episode. If you go to it, it's pretty cool. In this clip, Ruth is talking about her critique of the housing first approach to homelessness, which in her view, and I'm quoting from her directly in this interview, really amounts to housing last. So she discusses her problems with the housing first approach, and in particular, how it impacts families who are experiencing homelessness and are either trying to avoid being on the street or are trying to get off it.
In order to be counted as homeless, in order to be defined as homeless and worthy of a housing unit through Housing First, you have to get a 15 or a 14 on something called the Vulnerability Index. And that is going to require that you live on the street continuously for a year and have a disability. Or you have to show that you've been homeless, I believe, 4 times over the course of 3 years and have a disability. So you really have to have laid your soul bare on the street and develop some kind of disability or an illness or a drug addiction or something like that in order to be considered homeless enough to get housing. So if you think about it, that's housing last, right? Because you have to, everything has to kind of fall apart in your life for you to actually get assistance. That's not low barrier housing. That's a recipe for tent cities and chronic homelessness. Okay. So what you see now going on the streets of America is this policy is failing in plain sight spectacularly in the form of very sad tent cities and encampments. I mean, right now, over the last 2 months, a tent city has emerged on the front lawn of Union Station in Washington, D.C., which is right in between the Senate and Union Station. And it's just in plain sight now. So what's happened is people haven't earned their way into the homeless services system yet. So they're sort of trying to meet that 1-year duration requirement before they can get assistance. That is a phenomenon that has been set up over the last 15 to 20 years, and it has devastated homeless services in the U.S. And yes, it has come at the expense of families. Here's why. Families in the U.S. cannot live on the street continuously for a year because while we don't have a right to housing in the U.S., we do have a right to foster care. So if you're living on the street in plain sight with your children, the state is going to place your kids in foster care. They're not in good conscience going to leave you with your children on the street. They will put them into foster care and you will lose them until such a time as you can actually get affordable housing on your own. They can't meet the standard of being homeless enough to rank to get through the continuum of care to get services.
Clip number 3 comes from episode 72 of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, where we interviewed Andrea Elliott, author of Invisible Child, Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City, which after our interview, not because of it, but after it, Miss Elliott won a Pulitzer Prize for. So Elliott was a New York Times reporter when she first met Dasani, a young girl who was living in the homeless shelters in New York City at the time that the two of them met. Elliott would go on to basically be in the lives of both Dasani and her family for more than a decade, following them through their experience with homelessness, through education system, the child welfare system. And we talked about all of the things that she learned or thought about the child welfare aspect of the book that she wrote in this interview. This clip in particular, I think, is timely because we're talking about New York City, and she is describing a decision made by some school officials to call ACS, the Child Welfare Agency in New York, to express some concerns about how Dasani is being raised and being, frankly, asked to participate in raising her younger siblings and missing school while she does this. And I think what's interesting time-wise here is that you just had recently, before a civil rights commission, a former ACS official named Eric Brettschneider say that he now supports the concept of getting rid of mandated reporting and getting rid of educational neglect as a statute in New York, not just New York City, but in New York State, either of which might have influenced whether or not these school officials would have called ACS in the first place in the case that Elliott is describing in this story. I don't really, having read the book and heard her talk about this instance, really come away thinking that these school officials in this particular instance called because they felt they had to under mandated reporting statutes. It really comes off more as they wanted to give a wake-up call to Dasani's mom and maybe could not come up with a better way to do that, having attempted to directly reach out to her in previous instances. But that's why this is such a fraught issue, both around educational neglect and mandated reporting in general. So give a listen.
I know that Ms. Holmes and Ms. Hester had deep, deep, deep reservations about the foster care system and also ACS, and did not trust it, didn't think that it was good for the kids in their school. And at the same time, felt as mandated reporters that it was their duty to watch very closely a kid like Dasani and search for any signs that there was educational neglect or other forms of maltreatment. And then what do you do with that? And I think that one of the very sad and kind of telling pivotal moments in this book is when the principal decides to report the family for the parents for educational neglect after questioning Dasani and her sister about their child care duties. She does this reluctantly. She does it because she's frustrated. She doesn't know what else to do, but she also does it knowing that should they wind up in foster care, they're probably going to be worse off. And so it was a really sad moment to witness. I was there that day when it happened and saw the call being placed. And it was also a very big reason behind the principal's decision to push Dasani to apply to a boarding school and just leave altogether and to find her own way out before her family would be potentially dismantled. These things were all connected.
Clip number 4 comes from episode 73 of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, where we interviewed Chief Cadmus Delorme of Cowessess First Nation in Canada. We spoke to Chief Delorme not long after the country of Canada announced a major multi-billion dollar settlement with its First Nations around basically reparations for failures of the child welfare system to protect First Nations families in the past. Canada and the U.S. share a dark history when it comes to the treatment of Native American families by child welfare systems, and in both countries that includes the use of the so-called Indian boarding schools, where many Indigenous children were taken from their parents, separated from their families, and placed. Now, Chief Delorme here is talking about the impact that the boarding school era, which really was more than a century long, had on Indigenous families, and really in both countries. He's speaking about Canada here, but he talks about it in a way that I think really resonates and crosses borders here. He describes the difference between vertical lineage, the concept of generations of families learning from each other, versus horizontal lineage, which is what he describes as the impact of the boarding school era.
The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, very similar to the United States Charter, it assures and promises vertical lineage to any citizen of Canada or in many of the ones listening in the USA. What vertical lineage means is that grandma has the right to teach mom Mom has the right to teach daughter. Daughter has the right to teach granddaughter. Vertical lineage is guaranteed in a democratic, developed country. What Canada did in residential schools for 4 generations, from 1885 to as far as 1996, is horizontal survival mode. My great-grandmother, her name was Maggie. She should have got her teachings from my great-great-grandmother, Mary. But Maggie didn't. Maggie was forced to go to a residential school. Maggie went into horizontal survival mode with her sisters and cousins. They endured sexual, physical, mental abuse. Maggie had my grandma Evelyn, 2nd generation horizontal survival mode. Evelyn should have got Mary and Maggie's teachings as the Charter of Rights and Freedom promises, but she didn't. Evelyn had Charlotte, my mother, 3rd generation horizontal survival mode. And these schools pretty much taught you that being Indigenous is not what this country wants, and to submit to the Queen, to use the Bible for everything. And I'm not saying that those are bad things, but I'm saying it's the process of how horizontal survival mode went. Now, today, I am a generation that never attended a residential school. So my mother had to figure out how to do vertical lineage again. And now today, my daughter and my mom are like best friends. So fortunately, my mom and her bloodline were somewhat able to get back to a vertical lineage as our country's promise. Some families, just because there's no residential schools, they still are in horizontal survival mode. They need investment. They need kinship investment. They need language investment in order to bring back that vertical lineage. That is what residential schools did to Indigenous people in Canada.
Clip number 5 in the best of 2022 comes from episode 74, where we interviewed Jess Dannhauser, who had just recently become the new commissioner for the Administration on Children's Services, which is the child welfare agency and juvenile justice agency overseeing those systems in New York City. And Jess had just been appointed by a new mayor, Eric Adams, at the time. So the clip you are about to hear is Mr. Dannhauser talking about a particular issue that is sure to come up in the legislative season in 2023, and that is the concept of guaranteeing some sort of reading of Miranda-style rights to parents early on in a case where the child welfare system is investigating them. So this is something that the city council has considered in New York City in the past, has not been approved yet. ACS has been seen to be mostly behind the scenes, sort of pushing back against this idea. It came out in an interview recently, I believe from NPR. Mr. Dannhauser mentioned that they are piloting some sort of experiment around Miranda-style rights and alerting people to their rights sort of at the front door before an investigation begins. This will certainly come up, I think, again in the next legislative cycle. But in this clip, as a new commissioner for ACS, Mr. Dannhauser is explaining sort of his view of where this issue sits, the balance between guaranteeing that parents know their rights and the need of his agency to see children when they feel that it is warranted and necessary.
We believe parents need to know their rights, right? And that is a very important commitment for us. The knowledge is disproportionate, and we know that it is more likely that a white family will close the door and call a lawyer, or certainly a family with means will do that. And so we want to make sure that families know their right. Part of the other aspect here is that we have a legal obligation in the law to see children and assess them. And so we want to make sure we can do both of those things. So we're looking really fundamentally at how we can do that. We're a little bit worried that if we have a long list of rights, literally at the front door, we also have to talk about our responsibilities so families can make an informed decision. And that could be a really long time standing in a hallway, which could actually subject the family to greater knowledge and a lack of confidentiality about what's going on. and doesn't allow us to see the children and then be able to then share some of the rights. So we're looking at the timing of when the information is delivered. We're looking at the information. I want us to start thinking about, is there public education that can happen? Because putting it on the child protective specialist entirely is something that I'm a little bit concerned about. But I think there's a way to make sure families understand their rights, that they understand our authority, what we have, when we have to go to court, all of those things. And so what we're looking at is finding ways in sort of the meantime, find ways to learn more about what would happen, right? So if we did share with everybody up front and all the doors were closed, now we're in court on many, many, many cases that we don't want to bring. So we just want to make sure there's no unintended consequences. We've had good conversations with parent groups about this. I don't think they'll end up being a perfect consensus, but that's what we're trying to balance right now, to make sure we can see children and assess their safety, but also make sure that parents know their rights and can exercise them.
All right, clip number 6 comes from episode 78 of the podcast, where we interviewed Karl Wyatt, who is a digital artist really into NFTs and the blockchain. He spent quite a bit of his life growing up in foster care. So we talked about his art. We talked about how the blockchain may help keep some continuity and some connection with foster youth as they get older and even as they age out, which is certainly something that kind of came up as an issue policy-wise as states were working during the COVID pandemic or the earlier stages of the COVID pandemic to connect former foster youth with supports that Congress had basically approved for them. Anyway, in this clip, Karl is talking about growing up in congregate care to some extent and how his artistic expressions were viewed versus how he would have hoped they would have been viewed.
So I started off drawing like most kids, just doodling. And it started getting more serious for me when I was around about the age around 11 or 12 when I hit that age. And it was a way for me to kind of just escape everything that was going on in life. I would draw and go into my own little world, also with writing too. And I stopped that for a long time just because I would write stuff and some staff members would find it. And obviously it goes straight to my caseworker and, oh, he's feeling this way. We need to get him counseling and we need to get this. It's like, no, like this is my counseling. Like my counseling was that piece of paper and that pen to listen to me without judging me, like without like throwing stones at my emotions, you know?
So they looked at it and saw an indication of something they needed to do with you, as opposed to like, oh, we should be helping him develop this skill.
Yeah, you know? It was just like, oh, these are red flags, you know, like that. Yeah. He's feeling this way. It's understandable with liability, like obviously being in a group home, they have to report it, but it was just every time I spoke that it was always held against me by everybody that surrounded me. So for a long time, like I just shut down verbally. Took me years into my early 30s, actually, to be honest, you know, late 20s, to start speaking more socially, because just that whole going literally half my life with everybody holding what I said against me. So I just completely shut down verbally and just kept it all to myself, and would here and there at school still write notes and throw them away before I went back to the group home. But that's how I got into art at a young age.
Clip number 7 comes from episode 79 of the podcast, where we talked to Jason Smith, who is the executive director of the Michigan Center for Youth Justice. As you might imagine, we talked quite a bit about youth justice in Michigan with Jason, including talking about the campaign that he was influential in about 3 years ago, I think, right before the pandemic, where Michigan successfully raised the age of its juvenile justice system from 17 up to 18. Now, there are 3 states left that still consider all 17-year-olds to be adults in the eyes of the law. Every other state has raised their age to some degree up to 18. Those 3 states that remain are Georgia, Texas, and Wisconsin. So in this clip, you will hear Jason Smith responding to me asking him if he has advice for folks on the ground about how to shape a successful Raise the Age campaign.
So I do think it's a matter of time. just like it was for us. Like we knew, and I think the stakeholders here knew that it was inevitable. So my first point of advice is that it is an inevitable change. And I think the more that you get the powers that be, whether it's legislators in your capital or the juvenile justice stakeholders, to prepare for that inevitability, I think it will aid in making folks more comfortable with the change. But then two, like I shared about the public education events, it's key that you get out into communities and make people aware who may not know that 17-year-olds are all automatically prosecuted as adults, that outreach and engagement piece is key. Like, because those are the folks, as much as, us advocates can do our part, do our thing in the capitals and working with legislators to push them to make this change, it's hearing from them, hearing from their constituents, the voters, that society has shifted on this issue that'll make a big difference. And then I wish I knew how many, we would probably define them as non-traditional partners, were supportive of this change. I'm talking about the business community, the faith-based community, parent-teacher organizations, groups that we normally don't seek support for a justice system reform, especially a juvenile justice system reform. We're so passionate about this issue. And now that's a lesson that we carry to any kind of campaign we work on. But I would have started outreach to those groups much earlier on if I knew that there was such passionate folks in that, and that they would have made the impact that they did. They helped with the ultimate groundswell that, towards the end of the campaign in 2019, when it looked clear that the governor was going to sign it and all systems go, we were playing catch up in the media and other things to try to catch up with how fast the bills are moving, because it was just such strong momentum for that change.
Clip number 8 comes from episode 83 of the podcast, where we talked to Aaron Dorian of the Maryland Hospital Association and Carrie Etheridge of a multi-service provider called Sheppard Pratt. And we've talked a lot about in the podcast and published quite a few stories in the Imprint about the widespread problem in America right now of children without placements, youth sleeping in offices or staying in hotels because the system does not have any place that will take them or that they will agree to go to otherwise. And so that's a pretty unwieldy, free-form life for a teenager to be leading. One of the big issues is that when you have a kid living in an office, it's very hard to keep track of them or keep them secure. What we talked about with Aaron and Carrie on this podcast is sort of the other side of the spectrum problematically. The episode was called Stuck Kids. And the reason for that is what we were really focused on in this conversation is a problem that happened in Maryland, is continuing to happen in Maryland, but I think is really travels beyond the state borders. And that is the problem of youth in the foster care system being placed into an emergency setting, whether it's immediately being hospitalized or sent to an emergency room with a serious mental health issue, and basically ending up in the hospital system for months on end, not returning to the foster care system. So in this clip, you are going to hear Carrie Etheridge of Sheppard Pratt talk about what that experience is like for a youth, in particular for a youth who doesn't need to be there anymore. Many of these young people might come to the front door of this hospital system in Maryland needing some sort of intervention. Some do not. But as the months go on, what Carrie is describing is sort of the feeling or the experience of youth who are in a highly restrictive setting they probably don't need to be in.
Once the kid has sort of been stabilized and is feeling better, there's a couple of things that happen. So, a lot of kids, we can't deny that a lot of kids and especially in the foster care system have experienced trauma upon trauma upon trauma, right? Abandonment issues, having to go to multiple homes. I think, really knowing what happens as far as patient populations, I know what it was like to be a kid. We all do. You're on a unit where you start to connect with the staff. There's probably, unfortunately, for some foster kids, a little bit of an institutionalization thing happening, feeling anyway. But what ends up happening is structure-wise, some kids actually really thrive in the structure of an inpatient unit. So I could say that's sort of a positive that can happen. But other things that occur is you're watching other kids come and go. You're watching some of your friends that you might have connected with come and go. Schooling-wise, it's a big issue, right? So that we have home and hospital in the state of Maryland, but it's very limited. And it's been even more limited since COVID.
What does that,
And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but what does that mean, that they have education provided to them while they're
right?
there?
So because it is an acute stay hospital, there isn't typically education provided because someone's expected to stay a week or two and they get out of school for that time and an excuse is made and they go back to their lives and back to their school. We have something called home and hospital in the state of Maryland, which essentially is made for legally to address learning issues for kids who are quote unquote stuck in the hospital for a while. Typically, this would be more of a medical scenario, kids that are at Kennedy Krieger, at University of Maryland, other local hospitals who have more medical issues. And the counties are each responsible for providing a tutoring type of service, but it is limited because, again, this is very specific sort of guidelines, and a tutor, I might not be getting this exactly right as far as hours, but typically it's only a couple of hours a week. And the idea is work is provided. A tutor can come in by the county to sort of supplement while they're in the hospital, but it's all made and designed to be extremely temporary and very limited. So for the most part, these stuck kids, that's not what's happening. And so they're missing out on school. They're missing out on the socialization of school. Some counties are really great with getting some home and hospital in, some are not. And it gets even more complicated if the kid happens to have an IEP, which is even, is not going to be able to be met on an inpatient unit simply due to the nature of an individual education plan. So there's that. There's also limited, we are very lucky here at Sheppard. We have courtyards, we have a playground that's contained within sort of the hospital grounds, that we have a beautiful campus that as long as the kid is on an appropriate behavior and safety level, they can walk around and get outside. It's not like they're on the unit the whole time, but it's limited. It's not the same as being in an environment at home, being able to walk outside whenever you want, playing sports, that sort of thing. We do have a gym here, but again, everything is just sort of on a smaller level than honestly any kid would ever really want. Those are some of the things I can speak to. And every unit is a locked inpatient unit, again, because this is meant to be an acute psychiatric short-term stay. So they cannot come and go at their leisure.
Clip number 9 comes to us from episode 84, where we talk to former juvenile court judge Len Edwards of California, who literally wrote the book on reasonable effort standards in American foster care. He literally wrote it. It's actually right next to me as we're recording right now. In the clip you're about to hear, the judge and I are talking about hidden foster care, which, has come up on the podcast before. Generally speaking, this is the concept of transferring the physical custody of a child, or maybe providing a safety plan where the child doesn't leave, all by way of Child Protective Services action, but none of which ends up in court. So the physical custody of the child may transfer, maybe to an aunt, maybe to a grandparent, but the legal custody does not change as it would in a more traditional foster care setting, as agreed to by a judge. So what you're going to hear Judge Edwards talking about here is his views on how systems should be required to approach a parent, even in an informal sort of diversion process, with a guarantee of legal advice.
There are states that practice the notion of coming up to a family and saying, well, we'll take your kid now. We won't file a petition, but we'll provide services. And my position is they should say, and if you want to talk to an attorney about this, here's the attorney's card. And the attorney's office should be ready to talk to that family. And so, because frankly, when the social worker knocks on your door, in many families, that is like the police knocking on the door. It's the state, and the state is very aggressive, and you're very likely either to have a violent reaction or simply not to cooperate. You've got to give those citizens an opportunity to talk to somebody about their rights, because it's not clear to me that they would do anything without, they shouldn't do anything without advice.
All right, getting to the halfway point here. Clip number 10 comes from episode 87 of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, where we talk to Colleen Henry, who is my personal favorite guest we've ever had, because we have been friends for decades, but she also happens to be a professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College, and she has done quite a bit of research and scholarly work around the nexus between child abuse and neglect registries and the collateral consequences that many parents experience once they find that they are on a registry. So in this clip, Henry is talking about sort of a natural tension in a system where a registry appearance has an impact on somebody's employability, because as she explains in this clip, the decision makers who are assessing somebody to be put on a registry are not doing so with their employability in mind. So give a listen to this.
Social workers, I think this is important. Social workers, child welfare workers, when they're making the decision to substantiate, they're not thinking about the registry. They're not assessing whether or not this person poses a risk to children in school settings, childcare settings, hospitals. They're trying to decide if the allegations that have been made are true. Was the child who the case is about at risk of harm or harmed by the caregiver? That's the decision that they're trying to make. That's what they're evaluating, whether or not abuse or neglect occurred, not whether or not this person poses a risk in the future to a more general population. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And actually, the BuzzFeed article suggests that in Georgia, when workers learned about the consequences of the registry, because when I was a child welfare worker in California, I didn't really understand these registries. And it wasn't until recent years where I started to think about these registries and the impact they have and started investigating this in my own research. But, again, there's not been research on what social workers know or don't know, but I don't think social workers or child welfare workers who investigate allegations of abuse or neglect are aware of the consequences to families, the collateral consequences to families of being listed on this registry, right? They're aware of consequences of being involved in child welfare, immediate consequences to the family, but not these broader consequences. And the data from Georgia and the anecdotal stories from Georgia suggest that when workers learned about these consequences, they were less likely to substantiate.
Clip number 11 comes from episode 89 of the podcast, where we talk to Patty Dew of Epic Oana in Hawaii and Leslie Gross, the head of the Family Wellbeing Strategy Group for the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And our conversation focused on the Soul Family Model, which was conceived of by a group of Jim Casey fellows, youth with lived experience and young adults with lived experience, who came up with this as sort of a new idea in permanency. So traditionally, the way that a foster care episode might end with permanency is through reunification with a parent or parents, adoptions or guardianships. The Soul Family sort of offers another path that is more dictated by an older youth who perhaps would age out otherwise, for whom adoption or guardianship doesn't seem to be the right fit and reunification isn't viewed as possible. So in this clip, you're going to hear Patty Dew explain, the logic behind the Soul Family concept, which I believe is being sort of experimented with in Kansas right now.
We know that with adoption, most times, or all the times actually, biological parental rights are terminated. So a young person is really, a new family is basically saying, I'm going to take care of you for the rest of your life, which can be a really great thing. But to a 16-year-old, it's a little scary to think about severing all of those ties, because siblings have feelings about it, our parents have feelings about it. We don't want to stop the connections that we have. And sometimes that's the finite line of trying to figure out how to connect our bio relatives to our new relatives, because we want to build new relationships, but we don't want to let go of what we currently have, which no young person should. So I love that with Soul Family, a youth is able to, or their parents, the birth parents are able to keep their parental rights. And that also includes being maintained and connected to their siblings. We know that with legal guardianship, that ends at 18. We felt that it was not a good enough option because it just made this cliff of like, okay, there's a person in your life who's going to love and care for you and take rights and responsibilities of you until you're 18. When you're 18, you're done. Have a good life. We'll see you later. And we just was like, that's not okay that we're saying at 18, the relationship is done. So with that being said, they're also able to identify one or more legal caregivers who are able to hold those rights and responsibilities, and then also able to identify a network of broader caring adults. So these are the teachers, the mentors, the role models, all of the supporters that a young person has in their life, who's willing to say, I'm going to take care of you long term, whatever that looks like for you, because we know that people show up differently for that young person's needs. For example, a young person might want a teacher or a coach to be a long-term caring adult to help them on their educational pathway, or maybe it's an employment pathway. So we're really able to formally recognize these other adults in this person's life who can provide support for them.
All right, clip number 12 comes from episode 90 of the podcast, in which we interviewed Len Edwards, who is the former chancellor of the University of Manchester. He's a poet. He is the author of My Name is Why, which is a memoir that he wrote. And Mr. Cisse literally had his identity stolen by the care system in England. He was born to a mother who desperately wanted him, who gave him up for a short period of time to get back on her feet, and ultimately would not see him again for decades. He grew up in care thinking that his name was Norman. That was the name he was introduced to his adoptive family as, who ultimately rejected him, and he ended up living in congregate care settings for a very long time. In this clip, you're going to hear Lem talking about the process by which he came to find out about his past, about his real identity, his real name, the letters that his mother sent fighting to get him back, and all sorts of other details about his life that he had to actually sue the government to obtain.
I left care after 18 years. So 18 years is the official age of adulthood here in England. So I'd been in care all my life. And on the last day I was given, not the last day, a couple of years beforehand, I was given my birth certificate that showed that I had a different name. And I was also given, because legally they had to give me my birth certificate because I was going to be an adult legally. I was going to leave the care system. So they had to give me this document. And the social worker, who was a good man, my last social worker is a good man, he gave me letters that my mother had written pleading for me back to the social worker who she'd given me to have me fostered for a short period of time while she was studying in England in the 1960s. She said, I want Lem back. I want him to be with his own colour, his own people. I don't want him to face discrimination. So that only means that she faced discrimination, because Ethiopians love England, man. So for her to think that I would face discrimination means only that she faced it. 1967 was a very bad time here in England when it came down to race and race relations. So from that moment, I realized that a lie had been told to me, and I knew that files had been written about me every week or 2 weeks from the day I was born, and that somebody had those files, and that they were the people who'd been looking after me. Well, clearly they hadn't been looking after me, because I'd seen the letter, I'd seen the birth certificate. My name wasn't even my name. So I found out through an organization called the Children's Legal Centre, based in London. And I found out about the Freedom of Information request, which was that year, 1985-86, was applicable to the records that the town hall, the town council had. So I then wrote a letter asking to see my files relative to the Freedom of Information law, which was being passed in government at that time. And so I think I'm the first child in care to actually using the Freedom of Information request to see his files in Wigan, in that town area.
Lucky number 13 clip comes from episode 91 of the podcast, where we interviewed Diane Redleaf, a sort of legendary litigator in the child welfare space, really about a lot of things: her career, how it got started, her work on, either in court or through the legislature, advocating for changes that narrow neglect laws in this country or sharpen them up. In this clip, Redleaf is talking about her work with Lenore Skenazy, who is sort of the founder of the free range kids movement, which kind of been renamed as Let Grow. And sort of this is kind of interesting in that this was a litigator who spent her entire life focused on the rights of parents, with a movement that really kind of rallies around the banner of maximum freedom for children to grow up without a lot of maximal restrictions by parents and adults on them.
I started working with Lenore Skenazy, who's the president of Let Grow, in connection with the inadequate supervision category of cases that I actually worked on a big policy report on when I was at Family Defense Center. Because what we were seeing was the most cases, this was the very big, huge category of neglect, were kids who were allowed to play outside without an adult supervising them, or kids who might be left in a car for 5 minutes while the mother ran in for milk, these kinds of cases. And they were more common than the serious abuse cases. I mean, these kind of simple, really relatively simple and straightforward claims that should have been just the parents' right to decide, but they were getting swept in. And I actually got angry, or a little miffed, I shouldn't say angry, when this case in Silver Spring, Maryland, involving free-range kids, which Lenore is the founder of that movement as well. Let Grow comes out of free-range kids. This family in Silver Spring, Maryland, who let their 5, 6, and 10 walk home from a park, was suddenly international news. So why are they getting all the news when I had 3 cases in the appellate court that were involving immigrant mothers and poor mothers that weren't getting any news?
All right, clip number 14, episode 93. This was our interview with Sixto Cancel, who is the founder of Think of Us. We talked about a whole range of things with Sixto, including the new Center for Lived Experience that they've established at Think of Us. In the clip you're about to hear, Sixto is discussing why he is most bullish of all the possible, reforms and improvements to the child welfare system that might happen in the near future, particularly under the Biden administration. He is most bullish about significant changes in how we support kinship caregivers.
I see strong momentum and movement for kin. I see that, when the person in the room also was the Office of Management and Budget, right? And
correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're referring to Sherry Lackman, who founded Foster America before she joined the Biden team.
Exactly. So the top official in the White House over what the president proposes as a budget for human services, right? The top person who is responsible is someone with lived experience in foster care. And so what's the result of that? What we see is that in their budget proposal, as you all reported out already, like 10% increase in reimbursement rates to states for placing with kin, 5% decrease for placing in group homes, right? That we see $100 million added to Chafee, which is today is $143 million. So to make that $243 million, if Congress passes this, these are significant, substantial, actual, proposals that have been put forward. So there's a couple of things that the administration has done so far. What I'm very excited to start seeing, though, is how they're leaning into kin, how they're leaning into prevention, and how they're leaning into older youth reform. Those are the 3 buckets where we see folks asking questions about, we see folks trying to make decisions about. And what they consistently have asked from the field is, what are the tangible things that you all recommend to help us prioritize and figure out? And so I think if we as a field can, crowdsource some of those, and we're working on some of that, then, I think that we will get action.
All right, clip number 15 comes from episode 94, where we talked to Dee Wilson. Dee is a child welfare expert that has worked for a long time in the state of Washington, both for the Washington Child Welfare Agency, has worked for Casey Family Programs in the philanthropic sector. He's also the publisher of The Sounding Board, which goes out over email as a monthly missive on child welfare research and policy. Sometimes it goes well beyond the issues of child welfare into mental health and family supports. We co-publish or sort of republish The Sounding Board on the Imprint, and you can check back for that monthly in our op-ed section. So in this clip that you're about to hear, Dee Wilson is talking about his view that one of the big glaring problems in the child welfare continuum is that we short shrift the efforts around reunifying children with their parents, and that we should have a much more robust network of financial supports on top of services and all kinds of things that go into the process of reunifying parents, and that we do a disservice to the system by not investing more heavily into that part of it. So give a listen.
So we used to spend about $3 to $4 million a year for maybe 36,000 families, something like that. What I'm proposing to do is to spend 10 times as much of that as that amount in Washington State, to increase the poverty-related services in the state by a factor of 10, and to mandate it so that involvement with child welfare would be a benefit to families. It would be a benefit to very, very poor, low-income families. It wouldn't be viewed as a misfortune. It wouldn't be viewed as a type of social injustice, as a type of coercion or something. The child welfare system would bring huge assets and resources to families who really do need them. And at the same time, it would deal with chronic neglect with more than, of course, poverty-related services. You have to have a whole range of other stuff for that.
Clip number 16 comes from episode 95, where we interviewed two researchers, Justin Hardy and Kristen Ethier, about their joint work trying to sort of mine for what the existing body of knowledge has been on fathers inside the foster care system. So in other words, young people who are in foster care who are currently fathers or are expecting to be fathers. And in this clip, you're going to hear Kristen Ethier talking about sort of an interesting wrinkle, to me anyway, that they found here, which is that sometimes fathers would be involved to some extent in the research that's been done on parents in foster care, but really always or nearly always take a back seat to a focal point being on the moms. So Kristen is talking a little bit about that and how that has sort of diminished our ability to really study or focus in thus far on fathers in foster care.
There were some studies where mothers and fathers are lumped together, even though the sample is kind of heavily swayed towards mothers. What that kind of meant in the studies is that although the researchers kind of would generally say that the study was on young parents in foster care, pronouns would be female pronouns or feminine pronouns would be used. And also there are sort of theoretical frameworks or conceptual frameworks that are kind of used to study adolescent mothers versus young fathers, right? And so we could kind of see where some of those mother-centric frameworks were really dominating the studies at the kind of expense of studying things like engagement and involvement. And across the board, the story that was really told is that when fathers, in addition to having challenges engaging them in the research, the story told is that folks are really struggling to, whether it be caregivers or service providers, are really struggling to figure out how to engage young men in conversations about sex and sexuality, as well as to connect them to the specific services that they need and supports that they need to be able to father in the way that they want to. Yeah, so that's what there was just a real kind of implicit bias towards centering mothers, even in studies where researchers were saying that they were studying expectant parents broadly.
And would you say, I'm not asking you to kind of like land hard on your fellow researchers, but I mean, would that kind of indicate to you that the real point of the research was to learn about the moms?
Yeah. And I think that implicit bias carries into, I don't want to imply that it originates with research. A lot of the focus of services and supports for young parents is on, as I mentioned earlier, the mother-baby dyad. It's on pregnancy prevention among young women, and then it's on the sort of implicit assumption is that the father will not be involved. And so there needs to be a focus on the mother-baby dyad and the parent-child relationship between the mother and her baby. And that kind of gets baked into the research, right? Because there's this understanding that services are going to be built around mom and baby. And so then kind of all of the questions get built around the mother-baby dyad. And, the focus on the father is really sidelined. And that was clear in both explicit and implicit ways in the literature that we reviewed.
All right, clip 17 comes from episode 98, where we interviewed Marcia Levick, a longtime attorney with the Juvenile Law Center, and our kind of focal point for the conversation was the Kids for Cash scandal, which occurred in the aughts up in northern Pennsylvania. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about what happened here, but the sort of bottom line is that a very shady judge, really two shady judges, sort of conspired to close a public detention facility, open up a new private one that the county contracted with, and then, basically were brought down by the FBI et al. For taking bribes and kickbacks associated with making sure that the detention center stayed full. But Marcia and the Juvenile Law Center were on this well before it became a cash scandal, and were highlighting the really wrong-headed policies that the kind of central judge villain in this whole play, Mark Ciavarella, had when it came to deciding to detain youth for really minor incidences in some cases. Anyway, you should listen to the whole episode. We go through the whole thing leading up to a judge recently awarding $200 million to victims of the Kids for Cash scandal, which honestly is not going to, I don't think anybody's really going to see a dime, but it kind of put a fine point in a period at the end of that chapter. So in this clip, Levick is talking about the cultural attitudes surrounding youth and crime at the time that this judge, Mark Ciavarella, took the bench. The tough on crime policies, the general mentality that kind of was still present around the super predator myth. And Levick's expressing sort of concern that a similar thing could happen today with the concerns around crime in different parts of the country and the kind of misplaced narrative that youth are behind it somehow. So anyway, this is Levick talking about how to prevent past from being prologue.
In the 1990s, the platform that allowed Ciavarella to get elected in the first instance was a mythical platform of youth violence that was never true, even when it was first expressed, this notion of the super predator, teenage marauders coming to your neighborhood soon. And there is a concern that I think many of us in the advocacy community have now, that there is, again, a kind of hyper narrative being put out there of rising crime. There is rising crime. Crime is higher today than it was 3 years ago. That's a fact. Particularly homicides are up in many communities across the country. There's no reason to deny that. Overall, crime is stunningly low if we go back historically. But can we learn the lessons of the past? Can we remember that all of that frenzy to trust the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system to cure our woes and what ails us by locking people up really creates more harm than good in most instances? And I worry that we are getting swept up again in a climate of fear that will cause us to make stupid choices all over again.
On September 26th, we proudly put up our 100th episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, which is still crazy to me that we're already past the 100 mark here. But our guest for that 100th episode was Liz Ryan, who is now the top juvenile justice official for the Biden administration as the administrator for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Ryan is a longtime advocate of decarceration for youth. She founded the Campaign for Youth Justice, which is focused on keeping kids out of the adult system and preventing their transfer to it. After that, she founded Youth First, which works in tandem with grassroots organizations on the ground to try and close, in particular, very large youth training schools and juvenile prisons and things like that. So in this clip, we talked about a lot, But in this particular clip, Ryan is discussing one piece of the Biden administration agenda on juvenile justice, which is to treat children as children. So you're going to hear her describe sort of the process that they use to sort of figure out what exactly they meant by that and what their plan is to advance that piece of the agenda.
We've actually asked the field, what does treating children as children mean to them? And this is what we've heard. We've heard that we should keep kids out of adult courts. We should create incentives to keep kids out of adult facilities altogether. We've also heard that we need to eliminate some of the worst aspects of the youth justice system that mirror the adult system. And so we're treating children like adults. Things like solitary confinement, scared straight, shackling of children, things like that. We have also heard that we need to take a much more developmentally appropriate approach to youth justice. And these are all things that the research shows works. So what the field is asking us to do is to consider putting out policies, putting out research and policy guidance, incentivizing more appropriate services and supports for young people that treat young people as children, and helping states and localities shift away from kids in adult courts, jails, and prisons.
All right, clip number 19 comes from episode 104 of the podcast, where we talk to Tara Raynon of the National Indian Child Welfare Association. So Raynon was one of several guests that we had on consecutively over the course of October and November in the lead up to Brackeen v. Holland, which, if you have been listening to this podcast, you know is a court case in which the Supreme Court recently heard oral arguments. There are tremendous stakes in this case for child welfare because at issue here is the constitutionality on various fronts of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was passed in the 1970s at a time when the U.S. was separating Native American children from families at an outrageous rate, often putting them into boarding schools or in the homes of white people. So in this series of guest interviews that we did, we had several experts come on to talk about various aspects of the Indian Child Welfare Act, including the placement preferences, the active efforts standards, various things. We also had Kate Fort from Michigan State School of Law on to kind of talk through the constitutional challenges and what they all mean. Tara sort of probably had the hardest task of any of the guests because her topic was fairly wonky. She has served in the past as what's called a qualified expert witness in ICWA cases, but the clip you're going to hear really isn't much to do with that experience. It's a really good interview because it's a kind of an interesting concept and something that's not often discussed about ICWA, the qualified expert witness requirements. But in this clip, Tara is sort of signaling a hopeful note that really no matter what happens with the Brackeen case and the ultimate fate of the Indian Child Welfare Act, she believes that Native American tribes around this country are poised to protect their families, really no matter what the outcome of the case is.
We as tribes, we find a way to continue to protect our children, no matter what. And I think we've done that since time immemorial. We have done so many things have come our way to get rid, I guess, to say, for lack of a better word, to, completely wipe out Native people. And we survived, we were resilient, and we continue to move on. And I think, like you said, even if they don't have a qualified expert witness, I have seen this resurgence and this of all tribes across the country. You see it even how many tribes signed on the brief just recently. And it was so amazing to see that many tribes, nearly all of them did. And so you see this importance of what our children are, how they are truly our greatest resource. Tribes who are involved, they will speak for that. They'll speak for what they could be their own expert because that's their child. So whether they call it a qualified expert witness or not, who knows that child better than their own people? And so for me, I think as Native people, we will just keep going. We won't stop. And we'll keep fighting for our children. And we'll find a way to band together, to do it together, and to just build stronger systems.
All right, our final clip number 20, best of 2022. This is from episode 108, featuring our interview with Leslie Lacey, founder of Fostering Hub Louisiana, who I met at a conference about children's lawyers, because it turns out that Leslie Lacey was, in fact, an attorney at one point, representing both parents and then children in child welfare cases. But she left that all behind to start a really interesting organization that uses the provision of braces for youth in foster care as sort of an entry point to work with them on life skills, mental health, and overall well-being. So in this clip, you are going to hear Leslie Lacey talking to me about really the client that got all this started in her first conversation, where she was very nervous about broaching the subject of teeth and braces with a young woman that she had been working with.
I didn't want to be that person that they said, 15, 20 years from now, I was in foster care and I was abused and I was neglected and I didn't have all the things that I needed, but nothing hurt me more
than my lawyer
than what my lawyer told me. I mean, that's really what I was concerned about. So when I thought that I had established a relationship with Brittany sufficient for her to receive what I was saying, I said, Brittany, I believe you are going to be your mother's little CEO, just as she dubbed you. However, in order for you to be the most successful and accomplish the goals that you set, I believe we need to do something about your teeth.
And that must have been the longest 2 seconds of your life waiting for that.
Oh my gosh. It was. It really was. But when I opened my eyes and I looked at her, she had this look of relief and she had this look of elation. And she said, oh my goodness, Miss Lacey, I couldn't agree more. Let's do it. And when she said, let's do it, I mean, those were my marching orders.
All right, that does it for the Imprint Weekly Podcast, Best of 2022. We are going to be dark next week on the podcast on January 2nd. Check in for a special featured episode of a great new podcast on re-entry from the justice system. It's called Afterlife. It's produced by our new associate editor for the Imprint, Julie Reynolds. We're going to have a little conversation with Julie beforehand and then play one of the new episodes. And then we'll get back to regular order on the podcast on Monday, January 9th. I want to thank everybody that joined us for interviews this year, and to all of our terrific reporters at the Imprint for constantly giving me great things to talk about on the show. To all of our listeners, thank you so much for spending time with us and for downloading this show and talking about it. We hope to keep this going strong into 2023 and beyond. And like I said, check back for some forthcoming details about our Safe Camp podcast network. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voices Rising program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow, cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. And like I said when we began the podcast today, if you do that this month, your donation will be doubled through our News Match campaign. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always reach us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly. Happy New Year to everybody, and we'll see you in 2023.